Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Propagandacast Addendum with me, your host, Imperial Dane, Master of Propaganda. We're all here to cover a bit of a new patch coming up here, June 23rd. Yes, it is Tuesday next week. We've got the patch notes out, more or less, right about yesterday, according to this video anyways. And of course, there's a bunch of changes. There's some actually interesting sort of non-balanced changes. For example, vehicle skins, like for example this one, which is available with the Wehrmacht, will also now have winterized versions. So for example, for those people who do have those skins, they'll suddenly find themselves with a lot more skins. Just sort of variations again for winter or summer, depending on, you know, what there is sort of the original. Little detail there. There's also apparently some new skins being added, but I've got no idea about them. Oh well, I have an idea because some people at one point found a Dunkelgrau set of skins there. So I suppose that could be it, you know, that could be it. Dunkelgrau would be neat. But of course, that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about the actual bloody balance change. And there's a whole bunch of changes being made. For example, in terms of, well, criticals, there's changes being made there, for example, now with vehicles. There's, for example, some rather important bigger changes there. For example, you can't no longer sort of easily get, you know, destroyed engine criticals. In fact, there are several ways been removed from, for example, Panzerfaust, anti-tank grenades and the likes. And also from just, you know, the criticals when you hit sort of low health. In fact, the low health threshold has been moved from being at 0 health, that is, where it's sort of now is basically, you know, oh hey, it's essentially extra health because, you know, instead of blowing up, it suffers some kind of critical. Now it actually hits at 25%, meaning it's actually sort of a risk thing that happens at low health, meaning, alright, mein Führer, I can keep on fighting, but if I do, I very much risk something blowing up. And that's basically what's going to happen then. So all of a sudden there's going to be a bit more tactics and strategy, and for example people will be probably less sort of incentivized towards, you know, keep fighting with a piece of armor operating at very low structural capacity, because again they're very much going to risk, oh hey, gun is gone, for example, or engine damage, for example. I mean, there are some things there of course to keep in mind all of a sudden, which is actually a bit notable there as well. In that regard, for example, now Panzerfaust anti-tank grenades as well also only trigger sort of engine damage once the vehicle's been brought down below 75% health. That applies to medium and heavies. Light vehicles should still suffer, for example, so hopefully we shouldn't be seeing any M3A1 massacres all of a sudden, otherwise there might be some problems there. So of course it also means, for example, you can now be more aggressive with your, say, Panzer Force or an Ostwind or T-3476 and the likes on a sort of offensive flanking maneuver. You don't have to worry about Boris all of a sudden running up and going, "Oorah," and well, there goes your brilliant flanking maneuver. Now you have to suffer a bit more damage before that becomes an issue. So there have been some changes in that direction. Then of course there's also changes to sort of blobbing measures, specifically MGs. They now sort of have more incremental accuracy. They search wider, so in that regard, that is, you know, the units don't have to be so close to sort of trigger it, I believe. So in that regard, you know, things are going to be harder countered when it comes to blobs, which would overall sort of, you know, give further reason to use MGs as whoever you are. So there are some slight changes. There are also some factions gain further specific MG buffs or changes, so there are some things there as well. But overall, those are some of the sort of bigger, sort of more general changes. There's also another huge one, that is all heavy armor, more or less, has been sort of limited to one at a time, meaning only one Tiger, one IS-2, one KV-2, one King Tiger, though generally you don't see more than one. And if you do, someone's fucked up, or you're fighting Guderian, in which case you're screwed no matter what. So those are some details there as well on that matter. So that'll probably sort of resolve some things. I'll actually sort of, after I sort of discuss the changes, I'll sort of probably make some predictions as to what that can result in. Of course, I'll probably be wrong on some parts, and I'll probably right on some parts, and I'll probably be horribly right on some parts. So of course we'll sort of further go into detail about that. So it's going to have some effects there, and that's going to have some effects on certain call-in reliance. Beyond that, there's not really a lot of sort of general changes. The flamethrowers, for example, I think the flamethrower tank is less likely to blow up now. Otherwise, you know, it's less likely going to wipe units all of a sudden. It also is actually a bit more sort of regular in terms of damage now, which would, I suppose, also help in some ways as well. So that's neat. That is neat. Overall, it's, well, a bit less random, and overall that's sort of one of the things that really aim for. Less random. So those are some things there to keep in mind while playing the game. Then of course we have the sort of more faction specific changes. Of course there are some bigger ones There, for example, the so-sos are the ones who pretty much get the largest amount. Guardsmen, for example, now had less overall chance of dropping their PTRSs and DPs. Went from 1/3 to 1/10 of a chance of dropping it. That's bloody well notable. That's not exactly a small change there. For example, so Guardsmen are less likely to hand over the weapons to the fascist enemy. I'm sure a lot of Serb players will of course be happy about that one. A half-tracks get a huge boost. That is, the Quarter Mount now does more damage and does more suppression and performs better versus aircraft. So rule that things is a lot more nasty. SU-76 has received a damage buff, no, penetration buff, not damage buff but penetration buff. It's slightly more expensive as well, but that I think is overall it. I think it also received a health buff, minor one maybe. But overall again it's the penetration buff, which more or less puts it at the same range as the H-85. Of course it has less health still, less armor. Can't really spot for itself very well. And of course it doesn't quite do as much damage. Also in terms of sort of veterans buffs, of course of H-3, H-85 will still probably end up easily outdoing a veteran 3, H-6, but it might of course give some people more, you know, reason to sort of try and use the SU-76 there, alongside of course the AA half-track, which I imagine is going to become very popular. Other changes include the Soviet heavy mortar. That's become cheaper. It does less damage now, though. Also it's lost its precision strike. In fact, the regular mortar's lost precision strike. I believe the Katyusha's also lost its precision strike. So they got a creeping barrage, but the mortar's dead has received flares. They can sort of pop off at the enemy. So that gives the Soviets a bit more sort of chance of reconnaissance, as opposed to Soviets a bit more chance sort of, you know, wiping out units in other ways rather than just, you know, directly barraging in that way. They gain a bit more accuracy, but at the same time it's not quite, you know, one hit, goodbye Heinz. It's more several hits. You might actually suffer something if you're not moving out the way, Heinz. So some changes there in that regard. The B-Force also seems some change there, so it should perform a bit more overall stably, I think, and perhaps less violent in some ways as well. Beyond that, though, there's not really much else. Oh yes, the Duska got more penetration. The Duska's got more penetration. I think that's about it. Really, though, might have missed some things, and of course I'll go into further detail. Of course, and I'll probably updating some Propagandacast there, sort of go into further specific improved unit roles and the likes. But that's rather it. For the Wehrmacht, there's only basically two changes. Stu G has received a larger role change for that patch. That will receive one. In some ways, it basically gains more health, which means it's going to be more durable, which was one of the things that Stu always sort of, you know, struggled with. It was very easily sort of dealt with, which also meant there wasn't really much of a reason to flank it. Now, on your hand, has more health. Armor still not really much to talk about, but it's going to be less of a sort of immediate effect. Another change that's happened is it's gotten a lot more penetration, which means, of course, medium armor and even heavier armor has a much bigger reason to, well, fear it, which overall means you now have to sort of consider flanking it more if you're sort of playing with some medium armor, like say even the T-35s. You now have to be more careful, since you're not going to have any shots bouncing off you. It's going to be hard to sort of just shoot to bits. It has a high rate of fire of you in most likely case, of course, plus with target weak point, you're going to have some problems. So a pair of Stu Gs, for example, that's going to be a lot more potent. But that's not all. It also loses a lot of its splash damage, in fact, but it also gains less scatter. So while it's sort of less splash damagey, it might still perform reasonably well versus infantry, in particular with the MG42 on top. That is the Pindle MG. And in some regards, might actually perform better, since it will just overall be more accurate. But of course, it's going to be less sort of, you know, taking out several clumps. At the same time, it just might sort of kill them on here and there. So in that regard, it will probably end up more performing like the old Stug 4, if anything. From Company was one for those that remember that one. So that, of course, is another little detail there to keep in mind. And of course, for some people, that's going to be a huge change. I'm not a huge fan of losing the splash damage, but it'll still perform well right versus infantry again due to the scatter reduction, and it still has the MG, so it's not a complete loss. And again, I suppose it might also again force Soviets and other allies to sort of be a bit more careful about, you know, just charging at a Stug, which is alright, I suppose. Otherwise, it's the Stugi. Another one needed change, they need it, but basically it shoots slower. Also, it's got more health, but overall it shoots slower, which was one of the primary issues with that one. It basically shot so fast it could absolutely decimate units in seconds. So, small change there, and that's probably going to have some ramifications as well alongside that Tiger limitation change. Over Commander S, got a lot of changes. None of them are sort of really a huge one. For example, a lot of them is just basically to hold fire. Raketenwerfer can now move while camouflage. It is slower, but veterans bonus will help with that a bit. And that means we'll probably be seeing the return of an old tactic from company heroes, which is stealth up some stuff, move up, fire rocket volley, and sort of trying to do a lot of damage that way. So that might cause some frustration issues, and of course be a bit of a prickly issue for some people. We'll of course have to see how that actually works out, but that is still sort of a bit there to note. Some units gain hold fire, as I mentioned. Infrared half-track now costs no fuel. I've been sort of one suggestion there, so I mean that's going to be nice, obviously. Less chance there, of course, of wasting resources then, which of course might make it a bit more useful. Sturmtiger, Sturmtiger require less veterans now, sort of veterans, yeah, which, I mean, for the Sturmtiger that's good. For the Sturmtiger, I don't think that's a good idea, actually, since it's veterans 1 and 2, which is actually sort of really good for it. The rest is basically fluff. I mean, sure, there's veterans 4, but why would you use incendiaries when you can use explosives? That one's a bit of an oddity to me, if anything. Otherwise, there's not really any sort of hugely notable changes there. The MD-34 now does less damage, but suppresses more. And I think that's sort of really it. I mean, there might be some other I've sort of forgotten, but there's nothing sort of really sort of stands out in my mind as sort of being hugely groundbreaking and noteworthy. Overall, the Oberkommando really doesn't get any of the changes it needs. Infrared half to become more viable. Academy have to become a bit more viable. MD-34s, you need more incendiary rounds now to actually do damage. I think that's about it really in that department. Then comes the Americans. They get a small set of changes as well. Bit more than the Germans though. I mean, the 50 caliber now does more damage at range, so of course it's a bit more nasty that way, has a bit more punch. Stuart is probably the one that sort of receives the more notable change in that department. It gets more health, so it's tougher, less likely to get knocked out immediately, and it shoots a lot more accurately on the move now, which actually means it's going to be in that regard pretty nasty actually. It's going to be a lot more of a sort of a flanker, sort of quickly flank up behind some infantry units or an anti-tank weapon to like and sort of, you know, clear it out that way, but still staying on the move. So in that regard it's also a good pursuit unit, so I imagine we might see the Stuart a bit more because of that. The A half-track also gains some smaller changes. It can sort of shoot aircraft down without needing to sort of the Veterans 1 ability to do that. Instead it can basically just move faster as Veterans 1, so small changes there. The Stuart probably is the bigger one. But overall, is the Social really gains the Wolf's share of the changes, and more specifically the Wolf's share of the buffs. There's no real nerfs here as such, except for the Stugi, really. I suppose a bit the Motor Beam, and then they gain sort of some advantage. Then again, I probably are going to be some bits there. But overall, in terms of prediction, what does that mean for us? I mean, for the Oberkommando West again, Academy Emperors will most likely try and creep up on you, unleash a full deadly nasty volley, so you of course have to screen more with infantry, so be a bit more aware of that. Can't, you know, hang about with your armor out at the front camping, looking down at the fritzes. That's going to end up badly for you. But overall, from the Oberkommando West, you might see more infantry half tracks beyond that. Otherwise, I just don't expect much there. Otherwise, really, I don't really. Now, might be more Fallschirmjägers, more Jägers, probably breakthrough more, but that's it really. I don't think there's going to be change because the overall amount of options available is pretty much the same as before, which really means nothing's going to change. Although of course they might be forced to react due to the Soviet changes, of course in that sense I suppose we might see more Pumas. That's about it really, since they might sort of help counter the now improved SU-76 and half tracks a bit better. And of course the improved SU-6 will of course also counter the Puma quite nicely in some regards, so a bit give and take there, a bit give and take. I mean, for the Soviets, of course, it's probably going to mean there's going to be less players playing directly for an IS-2. We might also see more experimenting, for example, with, you know, the Tank Battalion Command and the Mechanized Armor Company, and now the half-track sort of packs more punch with the A upgrade, and of course the SN6 is also packing more punch. In fact, we might see a lot more players sort of trying to use that to sort of gain up a large amount of numbers to try and sort of deal with medium and even heavier armor. So that might be some changes there. We'll probably see the Guards motor more now that the heavy motor is cheaper. Of course, it does less damage, but we can get more of them, which I'm sure is something some people will be more than happy to take advantage of. Though, of course, at the same time, even that, in particular as the Wehrmacht, might see less of change because of the Stug G buff. Again, pair of Stug Gs will probably have a easier time dealing with the T-35 moves. Of course, it's not going to be all, you know, tea and biscuits for the Surge in that regard. They're probably going to be seeing a lot more resistance in that regard. Of course, we will probably be seeing overall a lot more Stug Gs from the Wehrmacht to counter medium armor, and of course in that regard the Allies will probably learn how to have to flank it. Otherwise it's going to be pain, lots of it, which they deserve. I mean, tragically. But of course, flanking would of course not be more necessary. It might result in less tier 4 because why go for a Panther when you can now get a Stu G which also performs reasonably well. Of course, there might be some who still go for Panthers, of course. I mean, it's not all, you know, set in stone. But still, Stu G will probably be seeing a lot more action, so try and deal with that. We'll probably see less mechanized assault because of that. There'll still be some people using it, but obviously not for the usual route of Stu G to Tiger. I mean, that's pretty much down the drain now. That's not going to work out very well. So again, we'll probably see more Wehrmacht tier 3, some more Stugs, Austrians and Panzer Force and the likes, a bit more mix there of armour from those, and of course in response from that, the Soviets will likely be forced to have to change up their plans as well. Same the Americans, of course we might see more Stuarts. In response to that, overall we might see more Stuarts, more 50 calibers as well, I imagine now with the increased buff, then overall better anti-blobbing, and overall that'll probably result in more MGs whenever sort of an infantry player brings up too much infantry in one spot. MGs will be called in to sort of deal with that. So I mean overall there's going to be some changes to the meta game, but Obercommander West will probably be the one least touched up. There'll probably still be some changes there, of course. Wehrmacht so to still where probably the most that's going to happen, but I think with the Americans, well, there's going to be some changes there to the meta game as well. In terms of how armor fighting's happening, due to the critical changes, that'll probably also see some larger changes. There'll probably be some players who sort of play more tactically, less sort of suicidally, because again there's sort of now deeper implications to an armor fight as well. So I mean that's going to open up some options, of course, plus now with the Panzerfaust and other things, there's sort of less of a chance of immediately knocking out the engine. Of course, there might also be more option for sort of aggressively playing without having to worry about, again, you know, oh hey, first movement, oh hey, my bringing in flank just got ruined. So there's a bit more incentive there for more aggressive flanking as well. So I mean, overall, that should lead to some regards more interesting play, but again, I think the players will still try and rely on Justin Collins, but they're going to find themselves a lot more viciously punished than they already are. So I think that's sort of largely covered. Of course, I've probably forgotten some things, and I've probably forgotten one really important thing. Feel free to remind me about in that note comments. I'll probably ignore it to protect my pride. But, you know, otherwise I think that's sort of really it. Of course, I'll try and make some videos sort of covering sort of, you know, Stu G's, A's and 6's further on, sort of detail the sort of now improved roles, other bits there as well. So overall though, I hope you learned from this video. Hopefully it's given you some ideas to sort of what to expect to the patch that comes here next week on Tuesday. Though of course for some of you it'll probably end up being on Wednesday, since of course it'll probably happen right in the middle of the bloody night for us in Europe. So little detail there, but still there'll be some change there. Of course I'll look forward to get some videos up in that regard. Though of course, due to the way I cast in advance, I will probably only sort of first really get to the new patch around, oh dear, Friday, I think, since I generally record episodes a few days in advance to sort of keep a nice smooth flow and also protect myself against any sort of hiccups, technical issues, where if say I get sick, then I can always have a few videos sort of draw on to sort of, you know, recover without having to stress. But still, just a little heads up there, just a little heads up. So let's hope you enjoyed, hope you learned something, hopefully you are now prepared for the big patch, or medium patch anyways. And if you are new, feel free to subscribe, challenge, well, not challenge me, but, you know, write in the comments, share it with friends and all that. So thank you for watching, and see you all another time. Bye!